So could you tell us a bit about yourself, Frank, and about the Scottish Recovery Network? You are a director of the SRN, right?
I am, and I've been in this post for just under 18 months or so. So the organisation's been around for a lot longer than I have. I started off as an addictions worker many years ago, and that's pretty much where most of my practical experience is based, I suppose. And I keep on going back to that addiction work when having conversations even now about recovery. So I worked in the third sector, so voluntary organisations for about 7 to 10 years or thereabouts in the addiction sector, and then laterally with statutory sector, so social work and health. So I worked with our National Health Service here for the last 20 years until I got this post. But a range of different jobs, which were primarily around supporting people through quite significant challenges in their lives. Initially around about addictions, but latterly in designing services with people who were going to use those services in places like Ayrshire. And my last job until I came here was working in a high secure facility in Scotland, Carstairs, which is the forensic facility for men in Scotland and Northern Ireland. So quite a range of a career, I think. I often say I don't know what it is that I want to be when I grow up. I'm still deciding, which gives me lots of things that I can do in the future. But it's a range of experience. I'm not a nurse, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a social worker. In some respects, it provides me with a kind of, I can sit on the fence in a number of things, but it means that I think I've got an objective view over a number of the issues that we look at, both in terms of recovery, but also, I suppose, in terms of addictions. The Scottish Recovery Network has been around since 2004 and was part of a series of innovations that the then Scottish executive had initiated in Scotland to address what was known to be quite a significant challenge in Scotland around mental health. And as I say, we were part of a whole range of other initiatives. But the primary focus for us was about being able to recognise the benefits of recovery as a concept, but also to be able to adopt it to a Scottish context, which was particularly important. So one of the things that led to the creation of the organisation in the first instance was a significant bit of research around people's stories of recovery and what those meant. And from those stories and the qualitative research that developed, we began to develop what I think is a relatively specific Scottish nature of recovery. And since 2004, we've been at the forefront of thinking around recovery in Scotland for quite a considerable amount of time. Developing things like a Scottish version of RAP, significant developments around peer support, and we can talk about some of those things later on, and also around how we enable services to change and begin to take a recovery focus. And some of these things were very successful, some of them were less successful. So we have reviewed all of those over the last 18 months or so and began to take a different tack, which I think you're prompting me to talk about here with the next slide. I suppose one of the key things for us and for me when I first came into the post was the importance of situating our work away from the esoteric, abstract concepts of co-production and what practically that actually meant for people within communities. Partially because I think there is a danger in having a centre of excellence and that being a draw for people coming to us and looking for advice and direction, and thinking that we have all the answers. Now, the notion of recovery is that the answers lie within the people that you're working with, within people themselves. and within the communities that they are living. But there is a need for support from external organisations such as ourselves. But being a strengths-based organisation, the purpose of the vision of Scotland, where mental health recovery is real for everyone in every community, is to ensure that if we didn't exist, these recovery conversations would continue to happen, and people would be able to recognise the recovery elements that they already have within their communities. So we're taking a very strengths-based approach. Our purpose is to ensure that there is continuity well beyond our existence, and that there is, I suppose, a constant challenge about what does recovery mean, because it does develop over time. Communities change, and our concepts of recovery adapt during that change, and we need to be able to recognise that recovery is a live thing. It's not something that's in a box somewhere, and we need to continue those conversations to ensure that that's the case. Now, part of the reason, or part of the message that we're now transmitting is that recovery is something that should be accessible to everybody in Scotland. It's not about a distinct group. It's not a small group over here that needs recovery, because the concepts of recovery are adaptable to everybody's lives. And one of the drivers for that really is to try and avoid the statistic that's ordinarily promulgated within the UK, which is 1 in 4 people at any one time have a mental health challenge. Our argument is that 100% of us as human beings experience distress at any point during today, tomorrow, or last week. It's a very common experience that we share. And if we say it's only this little group over here that requires recovery, then we're ignoring the benefit to wider society. And it also means that the challenge of normalising discussions around mental health are impossible if you only talk about the 1 in 4. It's 100% all of us that experience this. And that's why we focus now on the mission to place the experience of recovery at the centre of life, practice and policy in Scotland. The experience of recovery is something that those who are within services, not those who are receiving services necessarily, but the professionals who are there to help others also need to recognise.
Okay.
So recovery is important for those who are delivering services as much as those who are receiving. So you're going to ask something there?
Yes. So basically you try to have this ongoing conversation.
Yes.
With different communities, and including the city, a neighborhood, or and how is it? Do you have some activities to promote some conferences and things like that?
We have most recently had a conversation looking at recovery colleges and what those mean for Scotland. So yes, we do have events of that nature. But the change in tack and the focus on making recovery real is based on initiatives that were developed before I came into this post by colleagues who were here within the organisation, who are working within defined areas in the north of Scotland, in Dundee and Murray. And those connections were about bringing people together with lived experience and those who are delivering services, third sector organisations together, and to work closely with those groups separately to create a common conversation, and then to bring them together to have an equalised conversation. Now, this is I've simplified this quite considerably, but it is quite significant that the very first event that I attended was one of these collective conversations, and it was very difficult to identify who was receiving service and who was delivering services. So rather than this sort of dynamic where somebody had significant official power and other people had lived experience power, there was this dynamic where there seemed to be an equalised playing field. And that's the approach that we're taking through in other communities in Scotland. But the crucial thing really is that the reason why that worked was because of the relationships that individuals had there. So relationships are key to recovery, but relationships are also pretty key to developing new services around recovery. and developing and supporting those is pretty much at the core of what we're going to do for the next couple of years. So we can take advantage of our position in Scottish society, which is being seen to be an expert, being seen to be independent from health and social care, and to the Scottish Government to some extent, to be an independent arbiter. And so we take advantage of these positions in order to achieve our strategic aims.
And do you provide the services for individuals?
No, we don't. We are separate from services, and that's that is a strength, actually. I think others could possibly see that as a weakness, but it means that we have to work even harder to get an understanding of individuals' experiences. I suspect that those who are delivering services who were trying to do the job that we're doing would find a conflict of interest, because you've got a need to deliver, and I think there is some benefit in having that step back, that objective viewpoint, in order to make a case for change.
But I suppose you have several people in recovery in different positions in the network.
Well, I mean, that depends on what you mean by recovery. I think that from my own personal experience, I've lived experience of anxiety and depression, and I've been quite open and honest about all of that. I think this is probably the very first position I've ever had in my entire career where it's been okay to say that. I don't think it was when I was working for health for 20 years. That would have categorised me, and I would have experienced some form of discrimination through that being open. But in terms of engaging with those with lived experience, from 2004 onwards, one of the key outputs, I suppose, products was a peer learning network where we engaged with peers from right across Scotland to both learn from them and use that learning to enable us to develop. So there is still a distance. You asked about whether or not there were people with lived experience in particular positions. Within Scotland, we have an overall population of about 5.2 million, something like that. And we have about 80 peer workers in total in Scotland. Now, in comparison, our colleagues in Norway have almost exactly the same population, and they have 700 peer workers. So in some respects, we are doing extremely well. In other respects, I think we can learn enormously from others. But I think the contrast there is it's two very distinct health systems. And I think I was having a conversation this morning with a colleague from England, and I suspect the monolithic nature of our National Health Service actually makes some of the initiatives like peer working and enabling peer working to occur a bit more difficult than it would be in other health systems. Okay.
Well, what I wanted to raise is the culture in your own organization. You promote recovery and citizenship, but how do you, in your organization, is there a different way to work to promote a workplace that is in itself supportive of mental health?
We have to live by the principles that we promote, yes, absolutely. But remember, we have a total of 12 people within the organisation, so it's very small in comparison to other organisations. So we are influencers much more than we are deliverers of service. And I suppose one of the other, to give you an example, one of the potentials for this type of organisation is to ensure that everybody comes into this particular office on a regular basis. We cover the entire of Scotland, so we actually promote remote working as a way of engaging with other parts of Scotland. So we have to be very conscious that whilst that can be very beneficial, you can work from your own home and within your own environment, there is an element of distance involved in there, and we do have regular team meetings in order to keep people in touch with what's going on with the rest of the organisation. But in answer to your question, Jean-François, I think we try to live by the principles that we promote, primarily within this small organisation of 12 covering all of Scotland.
Okay. So we see here the values of the SRN: hope, compassion, courage. I was wondering, why courage?
To stand up for the principles. I think it's very easy for us to be distracted by different arguments about what the nature of recovery is, about the recovery principles in particular. So the recovery principles are primarily about being able to learn from lived experience and put lived experience at the centre of any conversation that you have. So whilst we have the benefit of that kind of objective distance from services, what we don't have distance from is the importance of lived experience in terms of those conversations. So I think that even within the recovery community, we have levels of schism, different understandings of what recovery is for some individuals and some groups. And I think from our standpoint, the courage is to be able to say, actually, we have to encompass all of those things. We can't say we're right and you're wrong. What we have to say is there are things that you are saying. For example, there are people for whom a diagnosis is really important for them. It is the beginnings of a road back in some respects. It gives justification in some cases. It gives validity to individuals, and also it provides access to welfare within our country as well. So to deny that that's an important part of the journey would be pointless. But equally, on the other side, we also have conversations which are about how do we ensure that the population of Scotland have as many interventions before an illness identity is generated. Because that illness identity can also be a trap. It can be a liberation, but it can also be a trap. Okay. So we have to sit with these two things at the same time. So there is an element of cognitive dissonance that we're talking about here, and the courage is to be able to hold on to that space.
Okay. Because here it's not everyone that that believes that recovery is even possible.
Well, that we also have those conversations with some of our colleagues within the medical profession who see it as an endpoint as opposed to something that people live with day to day. And there is some courage in standing up to all of that. But also, I think sometimes the courage is also to be able to say, my understanding of recovery is this, and to allow it to be challenged and to have the flexibility to have that challenge. So to stand up for the principles, absolutely, but also not to be so inflexible as not to recognise that other people's viewpoints have equal validity. I don't think anybody's really, well, and certainly in my view, nobody can say this thing here is recovery, and that only if you fit in this box is what it is. That doesn't help anybody. That's why we talk about personal recovery, because it's owned by individuals. And I don't think it should be an exclusive thing. I think we should be aiming to be as universalist as possible, which again underpins that conversation about how important communities are and why we talk about 100% of us experience the stress.
When I was in Glasgow a few weeks ago, I heard about a person who talked about how do you say this?
Chime.
Chime. Okay.
Chime. Yeah. With a Scottish accent. Chime.
Chime. Okay. And, it was a long lady who seemed to be really inspired by this model. Could you tell a bit where it comes from and how it is used?
This was a piece of research that was undertaken by colleagues in England. We had some input at the time, and it was a narrative exploration, again, of people's experience of recovery and what it meant to them. So it was a thematic analysis of a number of scripts from across the country to look at what was common and what were the common themes for people who were going through recovery. And that's what it threw up, that connectedness, relationships with others were absolutely central to what happened in terms of recovery. It was protective, it was enabling. It can also be kind of challenging to maintain relationships and to acquire those over time. The other elements were about the importance of generating hope and optimism. So having conversations with medical professionals who say, you have this condition and know you will not get better. There is no hope of recovery. That's an end point. That's such an inhumane thing to do to people. Whereas that's only one tiny proportion of what a person's capability is. So surviving the experience of ill health and living with symptoms is a challenge, and it's also something that should be, in many respects, celebrated, because you acquire different skills. You become differently enabled through those processes. So hope and optimism for a significant number of people who we would be hoping to support through other organisations may well be that they can use their lived experience for another purpose. So it might well be to become a peer mentor, a peer worker, or to set up in the room. There is no reason why anybody could not move beyond things. And taking hope away from people is the best way to crush any of their opportunities in the future. So it provides opportunities. I spoke earlier on about identity and how the illness identity and the wellness identity are important. That's one of the things that we really do focus on, and we have focused on fairly recently. And you can see from the description there that we talk about distress here as a universal experience. How you think of yourself is particularly important in the journey of recovery, and that was definitely coming through very, very clearly. Some of that does tie in with what we would recognise as valued roles from the citizenship perspective. So not having a valued role gives you a particular type of identity, but acquiring one enables you to get involved in civil society and connect with others. So some of these things are interrelated, as is meaning and purpose. Interestingly, Jean-François, for me, I often, when I'm describing time, remember the first and the last one, but forget the three in the middle. And the reason for that, for me, really is that I think that relationships are absolutely key, and so is empowerment. These two things are probably the two most important things for me as an individual, and have been through my experience of ill health and of health. And that's why I tend to remember them more than I do the other three. But as a whole, when it comes to thinking about recovery, when we use CHIME, it gives us a really useful framework to hang any concept of our recovery onto. And I think that for us in the SRN and elsewhere, it's been a really useful tool to move the discussions forward and to begin to look at things like how do we embed this within communities.
Okay. Okay. So I can see that you are very much basing your action on structured research, starting from narratives of people, and that becomes some kind of data that helps you to make your point towards the government to invest in something that is has some rigor, right? So you work with investigators in many places to Dr. Slade, I think, is an influential person in recovery movement in UK. And could you tell a bit about Scotland within UK compared to England? Here, you know, in Quebec, we are different from the rest of Canada. And I'd like to hear a bit about this point.
Yeah. I think we have lots in common with Quebec in many senses, particularly around the ambitions for the future in some respects. The difference between the UK as a whole is interesting. We talk about the NHS, the National Health Service, but the reality is not a National Health Service. We have a Scottish Health Service, and England have NHS England, and there are two very different ways of working between those two organisations. So way back in 2007, might even have been earlier than that, we abandoned the internal market within our health service, which was a way of purchasing different services off of one another, which you might have recognised from a private type of or an insurance-based health system. We haven't done that in Scotland for a long time, and that's probably the significant difference between the two systems. I suppose, again, just looking at the political structure, we have our own parliament, and we have a significant amount of powers devolved to that parliament. So in Edinburgh, our parliament is responsible for a large proportion of health, in fact, all of health, and increasingly more in terms of the international connection between our country and other countries. So that devolution means, in essence, that the cultural identity of Scotland is and has always been very distinct from that of the rest of the UK, particularly England. From my own personal point of view, I think there is a greater connection now between us and the Scandinavian countries than there has ever been with England. And you asked about research earlier on. So we're at the moment discussing potential research projects through the North Sea Fund with colleagues in Norway who came to visit us fairly recently, and they were hoping to replicate our network in their own country. We've also got very strong links with Finland, partially through the European Conference on Mental Health, but we've had lots of interchanges between those particular countries. And at the end of this month, I go to Stockholm to have conversations with colleagues in Sweden. So at the moment, we have greater links there than we do south of the border, which I'm not sure what that reflects, but it's just, it seems to be we have a better connections there. It's almost historical. We're going backwards in terms of our connections across the Baltic and Northern Sea.
Okay, it's similar to Canada. There is no mental health system for Canada. We have mental health systems in provinces. In the rest of Canada, it's okay for them if it's the Canadian government that takes some lead, but in the province of Quebec, it's very much tied to our identity. Health and social services, we do it differently, and it's really part of the difference we are as Quebecois. So I think there are some similarities here.
I did some teaching for Strathclyde for a short period of time on the social work course. And one of the things we talked about was the Anglo-American approach to care and healthcare, and the significant difference there was between that and what we saw, we recognised being more of a social pedagogical approach in Scotland, certainly in the past. You can see that from the Enlightenment onwards until fairly recently, which emphasised community over individualism. And I think there is a greater sense of individual responsibility and culpability in the Anglo-American system. So I think there is probably more of a similarity in our approach and the European approach, and probably with the Quebecois approach to mental health and healthcare.
It's very interesting because that's exactly how I discuss citizenship here in Quebec. We have this Anglo-American approach to recovery, very much, it's person-centered, great, but maybe too individualistic.
Yeah, which is why we focus so much on community now, because the individualistic aspect of it is it's not something that's common to the Scottish experience.
Okay. And we have here, your work is to increase knowledge and understanding of recovery, empowering people, influencing recovery-focused policy. What is transversal? How these dimensions are interrelated?
How they're interrelated? Well, I'll tell you what we do, and then I'll try and answer that question. The increasing knowledge and understanding of recovery for us has been engaging with universities, colleges, etc., to try and influence the teaching mechanisms there, and also to support the commissioning of research in this country and elsewhere. So rather than us commissioning it ourselves, we're participating in many other research projects right across Scotland to get a better understanding of what recovery means in a local sense. So because we're such a small organisation, we don't have a huge amount of funds. Our purpose is to influence others in order to make these objectives happen. So it's influencing, cajoling perhaps in some cases, making connections with politicians, which we've done relatively successfully in the last 6 months or so. And to influence that way. We've also begun to think about working on in fact, we are working much more on a regional basis. So Scotland's tiny, I suspect, in comparison to most parts of Canada, but we've broken it up into 3 particular areas. It means that we have a wider spread in terms of our connection with different parts of Scotland. But it should also mean that we start to gather more information about the variety of things that are happening right across Scotland. So in order to promulgate that information, we do that through our e-bulletin. We hold as many events as necessary to purposeful ones, which explore some of the key issues that are coming up for us. And as I mentioned earlier on, one of the most recent ones were about recovery colleges, not whether or not we required recovery colleges, but to begin to explore why we thought that was the answer when we weren't sure what the question was to begin with. So to begin to explore, are we fitting a solution to something that we don't know, we haven't fully understand the background to first. Because there is this tendency, I think, in many places to rush for a silver bullet. This is the answer here, this will solve all our problems, and then it doesn't, and we think it's the problem is with the solution in the first place, whereas we haven't spent enough time looking at what the problem is to begin with. We are working much more closely now with other organisations like the Mental Health Foundation, with CME, which is the National Organisation for Anti-Stigma in Scotland, and other mental health charities across Scotland to support things like the value of lived experience. And partly that's about, again, through education, through our colleges. More recently, we are beginning to look at how we begin to influence the educational outputs of schools and sort of preloading the experience and knowledge and resilience of children and young people in Scotland. So working with organisations like Bernardo's, which is a children's charity, Children First, and our colleagues within the education system, in order not for us to tell them what to do necessarily, but to support them in identifying the things that actually work with children and young people, because it's not an area of our expertise. We have always dealt with adults and beyond, for example. In terms of an influence and recovery-focused policy, practice and service development, we've always looked at good relationships with our colleagues within universities who are churning out nurses, social workers and other professionals who will support this agenda. But equally, we engage with government. So we're funded by government, but we're separate from it. So we try as much as possible to influence government in terms of recovery policy. Crucially for the Scottish Government mental health strategy, they mention SRN specifically as one of the things that they're going to support over the next wee while. And so in essence, the Scottish Government's strategy for recovery is us. So gain some comfort in that, and to some extent I suppose it gives us a lever in order to have conversations for that line. The other thing as well is that we've been very successful in gaining some funding for one particular initiative, which I'll tell you about, which is called Right to Recovery. So that involves solution-focused writing around about experiences of recovery. We found that really helpful, very effective with a whole wide range of groups. But we have now, thankfully, been able to convince our government colleagues to think about including this particular approach within their own setting, so that instead of us inviting people along from who are civil servants from government to see this in practice, they're doing it within their own facility. So they're learning about recovery, they're learning about the approaches to writing and how that can be beneficial within their own setting. Now, partly that's one of our intentions, which is to say that recovery is not just for those who we are working with, but it's for us, it's for everybody, and to try and promulgate that particular message. Your question was, how do we integrate all of these things? All of these things have an impact on one another. So as we increase knowledge, so for example, we know that a single model of recovery colleges is not useful for us. We need to look at what works in local areas, because the relationships are pretty crucial. We've learned that through research and engagement with people who have established colleges in England, and we've had some fantastic conversations with colleagues in Merseycare in Liverpool who have done some really innovative things that we have distributed within Scotland to try and enable that conversation to continue. We continue to promote within our statutory services the importance of lived experience and create opportunities for that for those conversations to happen. But we also have those conversations within the professional groups. It is a major challenge, as I'm sure you're aware. The Pat Corrigan research around honest, open and proud on paper looks really easy to do, but when it comes to actual practice, as I said before, it would have been really impossible for me to talk about anxiety and depression and my experience of it unless I had this job. I think I would have found that more challenging within the health service than I do now. And that in itself tells you everything you really need to know about the work that we need to do. In terms of influence in policy and practice, there's a constant interchange between ourselves and government. And more recently, I personally in the organisation have been invited on to some discussions around our welfare system. So welfare in Scotland and recovery are pretty much intertwined. Being sanctioned or having your welfare stopped for a minor infringement has a significant impact on your physical health, never mind your mental health. So we're having conversations directly with government about why it's so important to get this right first time and not to see it as a way of punishing people who are already in dire straits.
Wonderful. So I suspect that peers can advocate for themselves, and this brings the influence, and policymakers maybe are interesting in hearing about this new voice in the discussion.
Yeah. I think that part of the reason why 100% is much more important to us than 104 is to enable a wider conversation. So it's not about a distinct group per se, although it's important that those voices are heard. It's really important that people in power recognise that they've experienced something very similar, because it is a common experience, and not to say it's somebody else. And as soon as we begin to recognise that, it makes it easier for us to involve those voices of those who've had extreme distress continued because a system's not been right, a service has been quite correct, it's not been person-centred, it's not been focused on what their needs are, and it's focused exclusively on their deficits rather than the strengths they bring to it. These conversations are so much easier when those in government recognise that they also have experienced distress, which is similar but not the same as what others have.
Okay, let's move on. We have here the main characteristics of the mental health strategy, but you said that your network is the strategy.
It's the recovery part of the strategy, yes.
And don't worry, we won't go through each of these elements.
Okay.
What is Think Positive?
It's an initiative by National Union of Students in Scotland, which is a project to promote positive mental health within the student body. I'm not quite sure how it's funded, to be fair, but we have had a partnership with them for at least 18 months, maybe longer. So the Right to Recovery initiative I mentioned earlier on has been developed. It's been developed separately, but it's also being delivered within universities, partly through a partnership with Think Positive. So this is about promoting connection, hope, all of the things that are part of CHIME, but also with practical solutions. So one of the things that I think positive, I believe, been involved in developing has been buddying systems and supportive mechanisms for people who are going through traumatic times. I mean, being at university, having all of those levels of pressure on you, having to undergo examinations, very, very stressful for anybody, no matter what stage of development they are. Certainly when I was at college, as an 18-year-old, you didn't often talk about the psychological challenges of all of this. You just had to go in and do it. And I think perhaps having an open and honest discussion about the realities of what all of this pressure does to you psychologically is one of the things that is beneficial about, I think, positive approach.
Okay. And in Quebec, the psychotherapies are not covered by universal health care. You get to be reimbursed for your medication, but not for psychotherapies. Is this the case also in Scotland?
Well, it's a national health service, so it's a universal system. So yes, it is covered by universal health care. All psychological therapies are, but there's a high demand for them. So I can remember way back in 2002 being part of a working group that was looking to try and reduce the waiting list for psychological therapies from 9 months to 1 month. And I think the average waiting time now is still about 6 months or thereabouts. So it's not ideal. But I suppose our purpose, our reason for being around here really is to try and promote alternatives to those psychological therapies in some respects, to promote connection and relationships and all these other elements that can be supportive until people have access to the therapies that they require.
Okay. We have this project here in Montreal to really make sure that people with, for example, schizophrenia, they face the diagnostic overshadowing phenomenon, and because their physical health is not thoroughly investigated. And we would like to see in the official health records that there are some exams that are done, that should be done. And on this particular aspect, are you aware of a project that would that would monitor more screening about physical health of persons with mental illness?
I believe that those figures are recorded somewhere. I'm not quite sure where they are recorded at the moment. But all of there's 40 intentions, 40 ambitions within the mental health strategy. And one of the intentions is to create a series of indicators that will show what progress has been made against all of these. And they are not going to be released until the second biannual review, which happens on the 6th of December. So I might be in better place to answer your question after then. But my understanding at the moment is that these records are kept separately at present, which makes monitoring the equality of esteem between health and mental health really difficult to monitor at present.
Okay. With Larry Davidson, we saw that with the new legislations, maybe peer support will become integrated into quality care in a model of support that would be reimbursable by insurances, for example. What do you think of peer support as an accommodation, a social accommodation?
I think it's particularly helpful. I have to be honest, I think that the terminology might be a bit of a trap. I think one of the things that I think might be more helpful, because what we're really talking about is supporting people through life, that there might actually be a better terminology, and it might be life coaching around this, because that's fairly universal. Again, it comes back to what we were saying earlier on about trying to normalize our conversations about mental health. And I think that terminology helps also the peer who is part of that process to have a career beyond the peer element that they're associated with. And the reason why that comes to mind is that one of our colleagues, Chris White, who works with the Mental Health Foundation, gives us an example of somebody had been a peer worker for a number of years and then decided they wanted to move into banking. And banking doesn't have the openness that perhaps we have in the mental health field, and it may well be a barrier to making those extra steps. Now, for some people that may not be a problem, and having a career in mental health might be their ultimate ambition. But I think if we reduce those opportunities, then, or if we can find a way of opening those opportunities, then that should be done. But your question was, should this be a social good? And I think absolutely it should do. The legislation that your arrow points to is more to do with the financial affairs of individuals who are judged by the legal system to be without capacity to make financial decisions and other decisions about their care. Those welfare guardians are primarily social workers and or lawyers, and our Mental Welfare Commission has an oversight over all of those sorts of things. So it's slightly different from what you were asking. There may well be a useful engagement there with peers or life coaches to support that, as opposed to having layers of legislation that do so. I suppose there's a really good argument to say that the more legislation you have, the less freedom you also have. Okay, thank you.
You talk about the biannual forum.
Yeah.
So it started.
It did. It began, the very first one happened in December of last year, and then there was another one in June, and the one that's upcoming in the 6th of December begins to look at a collaboration. So the purpose of the biannual review, or the biannual forum, is to monitor amongst a range of stakeholders whether or not the mental health strategy is meeting its objectives. It does mean that it brings together a range of actors within the mental health field in Scotland who may be competing with one another for particular sources of funding. So it kind of leads to a very interesting conversation. But crucially, from my conversations with officials most recently, I think what they are saying to us at the moment is that they are keen that the mental health strategy is not seen as something written in stone. It needs to be responsive and reactive to conditions on the ground. So the part of the purpose of the biannual forum is to bring reports about progress and to get genuine responses for those who are delivering or delivering services or advocating on behalf of people with lived experience and people with lived experience themselves within the room. Are we doing what we need to be doing? Do we need to change the strategy? Do we need to change some of the elements of it? I think it's one of those things that it sounds great, and I think we need to see this actually happen over the next, certainly at this next meeting, and that there has been a responsive reaction to what's being said then at the next biannual review. Because otherwise, I think this is the big concern for most of us, is it could become a talking shop, and we all look good and feel good about it, but we don't actually change things on the ground. And for almost all of us, it's the change that's important, not the talking.
Okay, wow, well said. I went through this document peer-to-peer, and that's what we're trying to develop in Montreal with this new program of recovery mentorship. It's you have all these sessions. Is this a class people register to a semester-long program or something like that?
You use it as you wish to use it. You can create it as a semester class if you wish. We don't dictate how it's operated. We don't have a training for trainers program. The reason it was created in the way that it was is that people can use it in whatever way is necessary in order to achieve the goals that they wish to achieve. So there are, and it's all been tested rigorously, both in the UK and with our colleagues in Spain, Romania, Bulgaria, Italy, and the others. So it was a real multinational approach to how do we develop peer work in each of our countries. So it's not dictatorial. So if there are bits of it that you want to use, then you should use them as you require. You can follow it linearly if you feel that is helpful. but it's not mandated. It's not mandated to be done in a particular way. But we have a huge amount of evidence that no matter how you use it, having these sorts of discussions in this way is very, very effective in order to generate the peerness that we're looking for.
So it's not something manualized like the PAC theme, or so. I have your permission to adapt it in Montreal.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Okay. Yes, that's what it's for. So do whatever you need to do with it. It's free, and have fun with it.
We will.
Good.
And finally, maybe you could have fun yourself in saying a few words about citizenship. This is the home page of the SRN website. Citizenship is all over the place, right?
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting concept because certainly if we were to drill it down in Scotland or in the UK, we would say we're not citizens. We are subjects.
Yeah, as we are in Quebec. Yeah,
indeed. However, I think there is an interrelationship, I think, between some of the things we were discussing fairly recently around recovery colleges. In fact, one of the presenters who we had as part of our information session was Craig Winter from Turning Point Scotland. He was talking about the Valued Role project and the other elements that Turning Point Scotland have taken forward. So from a Scottish context, what they've done is they've taken the Yale handbook, similar to what I would expect you to do with peer-to-peer, and they've made it a Scottish version. And I think for us, there is this interconnection between recovery and becoming full citizen with, or enabled to become a full citizen with the right to have responsibilities. That quote sticks in my mind from Michael Rowe from the very first time that I heard it at Yale, all those 18 months, 2 years ago. So providing the opportunity for people to regain that confidence and to recognise that they have value to add to all of to their local community.
Yeah.
They have a right to be part of that. That's an output. That's a goal. That's an intention. That's what recovery should be all about. And I think there is a significant interrelationship between both of those things.
Okay. So thank you very much, Frank. I noticed that you also present yourself on the website as a musician.
Yes, indeed, yes. And we will get to play together at some point, I'm sure. Hopefully in the same room rather than across the Atlantic.
Okay. Well, thank you again. It was very insightful, and I'll keep you informed about what we're doing with the peer-to-peer adaptation in Montreal.
It would be really interesting to hear how you adapt it.
Okay. Thank you again. Have a good day.
And you. Goodbye. Cheers.
Bye.